4. Hans. Once below the Kármán line, the Valkyrie drew a wide arc in the thickening atmosphere. Initial impulse and direction had been provided by the lot and calculated for optimal navigation. Hans barely had to touch the stick to keep the Valkyrie on course. The first rays of the sun were peeking from behind the Earth's curvature. The sunrise was different up where the horizon was no longer a straight line. The weather was clear, but a storm was gathering ahead. Dark clouds were forming above the trees where Hans was headed. He flew the Valkyrie manually. He did not want a log of his destination. The coordinates placed his landing zone 100 kilometers south of the Venezuelan border, right in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, an area which was not considered friendly to vehicles of any sort, flying ones included. He hoped that whoever was on the ground had thought of where Hans would be landing his lift. He felt in the storage bin above his head. It was empty. Motherfucker. Art had taken his book again. He rummaged around hoping for something to read and found a magazine instead. He did not remember having bought it. Art's, probably. The cover story was about the preparations for the 5th anniversary of the Morothì arrival. The people of Moro had arrived without a warning and without a single blip being registered on any of Earth's satellites 5 years ago. Their planet was a mere half a light year away, yet all of Earth's science had never even fathomed there could be another sun so close. Humankind's greatest revolution had taken place on television on a gray November morning without anybody having to leave their homes. Hans looked up and saw he was approaching the coordinates he had been given. He maneuvered down and started searching for a place to land amid the unbroken ocean of treetops. It was not until he was over the coordinates that he noticed an opening in the canopy. The rolling greens of the treetops suddenly gave way to the browns of the trunks as abruptly as if these had been ripped out of the earth. It was as if the small clearing had been cut straight into the jungle. Hans recognized the signs of explosives once he was low enough. He calculated that whoever was waiting for him had blasted enough trees to land a half a dozen lifts. The forest was so thick that many of the trees hadn't managed to fall to the ground, but had gotten tangled in the vegetation and were being kept propped up at weird angles. Then he saw them and knew something was wrong. Fucking Eddie. He had to stop pulling this kind of shit. Eddie had not mentioned there would be rats on the ground, and Hans could count at least 2 down there. They were tiny seen from up here, 2 figurine-sized black specks standing against trees and thick vegetation the height of a 10-floor building. Hans could not see trace of an airborne vehicle, and the forest was too thick to believe the rats got here cross-country. The crates he was carrying would need some form of transportation to be moved out. He punched a short sequence in the Valkyrie's computer, and thick, oily smoke started pouring out of the engine. He jerked the stick, shaking the Valkyrie a couple of times before landing with a thud. Hans opened a panel next to the hatch, unclipped a wire, and closed the panel again. Then he grabbed the fire extinguisher and ran out to spray the leaky engine. It had been years since he had carried a gun, but stepping out of the Valkyrie without one suddenly felt like a bad idea. "Any chance one of you knows how to fix this?" asked Hans, pointing to the Valkyrie's engine after it had stopped oozing smoke. There was stuff crawling under the crushed vegetation. Hans could feel bugs with too many legs slithering between his feet. There was a long crunch each time he took a step, and Hans was not sure he wanted to know what was causing it. There were sounds of larger animals coming from behind the trees. Monkeys and birds, Hans guessed. He hoped there was nothing bigger staring through the branches. The 2 rats looking at him were not amused. "What's the problem?" asked one, walking up to him. Hans gave him a look of, "How the hell should I know?" He could smell the rat once he got close. These 2 must have been out here for some time with no chance of even using their powder. What was it called again? Nesty? Rats had a distinct body odor, something between rotting fish and cabbage left to stew for too long. It was usually bearable for short periods of time, and the ones who had the most contact with humans had learned to shower. The others continued using their powder, which they doused themselves in as if it were talcum. The powder was supposed to break up dirt and bacteria, and then dust it off on its own. And so it was you could see fluffy white clouds blowing out of their sleeves, their trousers, and their collars. It was a plant extract, they assured everybody. All very natural. as if that made the smell any better. "How long to fix it?" asked the rat in a squeaky voice. For all their impressive appearance, rats sounded like little girls when speaking. They also tended to swallow their vowels, but this one seemed to have learned better than his brethren. "I don't know. Let me run the diagnostic first." Hans stepped back into the Valkyrie and started a full diagnostic. This would take some time. He had not noticed any weapons on the two rats. Then again, you didn't need a weapon when you were 2 meters tall and weighed 120 kilos. Not against Hans, at least. He was quite ready to drop to his knees and swear allegiance to Moro if they asked him to, or if they paid him enough. One of the rats walked in while Hans was staring at the screen. "So? It will take some time," said Hans, trying to get him to leave. He didn't want the Valkyrie to smell of rat. "How long?" "Depends on what the problem is. Get out." The rat stared at him and then walked out. "I'll open the cargo bay. You can start unloading." The loading bay hatch popped open with a hiss. "How are you going to get these out of here?" asked Hans, walking over and indicating the crates. "Not your concern," answered the rat, making no move to enter the cargo compartment. "You are not paid for this." It was hard to believe that these guys had developed technologies which allowed them to cross the galaxy. Carving stone wheels seemed more of a challenge in their league. "The crates are not going to unload themselves," said Hans. "I'm not paid for this." The rat turned away and went to talk to his friend. Hans went back to the cockpit and slumped into his seat. He was not sure there was something wrong, or he wouldn't have landed, but something was bothering him. One thing he had learned in the army was not to panic and not to overreact. Even in the worst situation, when you had a Gomer on your six and couldn't shake him off, he had learned to let the enemy make the first mistake, not to make it for him. Hans looked at the screen. The fake diagnostic wouldn't be long. Finally, the screen flashed, beeped, and displayed some random nonsense. Hans dug out his toolbox and walked to the engine. "What is it?" asked the rat. "It says the heat sink is not responding," he said, walking out. "I'll need to open the outer panel to see what's causing it." The rat looked at him with what Hans assumed to be a lack of trust. Not that he knew what lack of trust looked like on a rat. "Let me see if I can help," said the rat, walking toward the cockpit. "Hey!" cried Hans. "Don't touch my lift!" The rat didn't bother to respond to that. He sat down in Hans's seat and started playing with the controls as if he were familiar with the system. He grunted, shook his head, and after some minutes of evident frustration, Hans wasn't sure he could recognize that either, he stormed out. Hans managed to get out of his way just in time. Hans dismantled the outer panel and tinkered with the engine behind it while the two rats were unloading the crates. They lined these up next to a gap in the trees, which he hadn't noticed. He walked into the cargo bay and saw that they had taken all the crates. There was a US patch still wrapped in plastic lying on the floor. It was one of those normally attached to military uniforms. Hans thought of telling the rats they had dropped something, but instead went back to the panel and stared at the engine. "Is it working now?" asked the rat. "No," he said, closing the panel. "What's the problem?" "I don't know. I couldn't find anything wrong. I'll run the diagnostic again. If it tells me the same thing, I'll need to radio in for help." "You cannot do that," said the rat. "No worries. You get rid of those crates and I'll say that I had a malfunction. My manifest says that I should be flying empty anyway." "No," he repeated. Hans restarted the diagnostic, closed the cargo bay, and casually walked out to stretch his legs. "Anything special with these batteries for them to be delivered in the middle of nowhere?" asked Hans, walking over to the crates. "None of your business," replied the rat. He walked behind one of the trees and grabbed a backpack. Inside was a bottle of export whiskey. The two rats took a long swig, and Hans feared that they would invite him to share the bottle with them. To his relief, they did not. They certainly loved their whiskey. All of them did, to the point that it was difficult to take them seriously after seeing them down half a bottle. The spirits industry was making a killing, at least the whiskey and vodka producers were, although looking at these two, Hans was sure they would drink anything with a high enough alcohol grading. Hans watched them take a couple more swigs and made his way back towards the toolbox he'd left close to the Valkyrie. He was ready to make his exit. He pretended he was checking if all the tools were in place and that he was in no hurry whatsoever. The two rats were making a racket and weren't paying attention to him. He was closing the box when he heard a loud crash. Hans couldn't understand what had caused it until he turned around and saw one of the rats lying on the ground, half sprawled on top of a crate. This had tipped over and its contents had spilled out. It took Hans a couple of seconds to realize whatever he was looking at scattered over the forest floor. It was not AG batteries. Hans was no expert, but he was sure AG batteries did not look like scrap metal and packing foam. The forest seemed to go quiet all at once. The two rats looked like they had reached the same conclusion and gave him a look of pure hatred. Hans only managed to take 2 steps before the first rat came crashing into him and tackled him to the ground. Hans fell face down, chewing dirt and mangled vegetation. The hairy brute started climbing over him while pinning Hans's legs with his massive arms. Hans tried pulling himself out of his grip, but the rat was too strong. It was as if a block of stone had fallen onto his legs and was slowly rolling up. He looked over and saw the toolbox he had dropped. He grabbed it and managed to twist his body just enough to smash the box into the rat's head. Tools went flying in all directions. The rat brought his hands to his head and rolled off Hans's legs. Hans only had the time to stand up before the second rat rammed into him. Hans was again thrown to the ground, and this time his arms were pinned more efficiently. With 120 kilos sitting on his chest, no weapon within reach, and his arms immobilized, Hans was at the rat's mercy. The first rat picked himself up and massaged his temple. He looked at Hans while the rat sitting on his chest grabbed Hans by the throat and started pummeling his head with a ham-like fist. The first punch felt like he had been hit with a sledgehammer. White pain shot through his skull. It was so strong that Hans stopped breathing. The second punch was even more painful. Then the pain subsided and the world lost focus. Hans had no idea how long the rat went on after he passed out. He came back to his senses slowly. He could feel a general numbness, an inability to move, and a vague pain from the edge of his consciousness. It took him a while to be fully back in the present. For a time, the world did not make sense, and he had no idea where he was or what had happened.
"What is this shit?" the rat shouted in his gurgly voice. "Where is our stuff?"
The rat dropped to one knee next to Hans and slapped him hard. The world came painfully into focus.
"Where's our stuff?"
he repeated. Hans could taste blood in his mouth. His lips were swollen and he couldn't breathe through his nose. What worried him most was that he could barely open his eyes. He tried moving his mouth and the pain came crashing in all at once like a team of horses galloping on his face.
"What the fuck have you done with our stuff?"
The rat was screaming and was swallowing more vowels than he had when he was calm. Hans tried mumbling something. Nothing coherent made it past his lips. The first rat grabbed his throat again, but his friend said something and the rat let go.
"You've been paid very well to make this delivery," said the rat, sitting on his chest. "Have you not?"
Hans tried mumbling again.
"Just nod if you understand me."
The rat was speaking with the relaxed countenance of a snake talking to a rodent wrapped in its coils. Hans nodded as visibly as he could, although he wasn't sure if this was as conspicuous as he hoped.
"This cargo is very important for us, do you understand?"
Hans nodded again.
"What you brought us is not what we expected, and we need what we came for. We need it very much. We will not leave without it, and neither will you. Do you understand?"
Hans nodded. The rat adjusted his weight, and Hans managed to free one arm. The rat didn't seem to feel threatened by this small act of rebellion. He spoke something to his friend, who stood up and walked to the open crate.
"Look,"
said the rat, pointing at the crates. Hans tried looking, but his head was not responding as he expected. He saw instead a screwdriver laying next to him. It must have fallen when he hit the first rat with the toolbox. Hans's head was clear enough to believe the rat's threat and to understand that he didn't have many options. He didn't think. Hans grabbed the screwdriver and plunged it into the rat's thigh. The rat gasped and made a grab for Hans's hand, but Hans had already pulled the screwdriver out and was slamming it into the rat's side once, twice, 3 times. The Ret bent over, holding his side, and Hans hit him again. Hans pushed and the Ret rolled over effortlessly. It was only then that the other Ret turned around and realized what was happening. Hans picked himself up. He was only a couple of steps from the Valkyrie's hatch, and he crossed the distance as fast as his wobbly legs would carry him. For a second, he thought these weren't going to hold his weight. Hans stumbled inside without getting caught. He punched the button, closing the hatch, but the Ret managed to slide his arm through and kept the hatch from closing. Hans tore the screwdriver into the Ret's hand again and again until the Ret pulled his arm out, his hand in a bloody mess, and the hatch slid shut. Hans dropped the screwdriver, reattached the wire he had unclipped, and jumped behind the stick. He punched a series of commands into the computer, reinitializing the system, while the Ret with the mauled hand disappeared behind the trees. The takeoff sequence was never fast enough when you needed it. The Ret reappeared with what seemed to be a shotgun. Hans's thumb pressed an imaginary button at the back of the stick. It took him a moment to remember that the Valkyrie was not fitted with a pair of Gatling guns. The Ret pointed the shotgun at the cockpit and pulled the trigger. There was a loud bang, and a tiny nick appeared on the glass. The Ret pulled the trigger again, and the nick became a small crack. The engines were igniting, but ever so slowly. Hans resisted the urge to carry out his pre-flight check. He heard another shot, and then another. He didn't dare look at the Ret, who was pumping and shooting with practiced rhythm. He pulled on the stick and lifted the Valkyrie out of the clearing. Another shot came crashing into the glass.